And now I want to share with you some thoughts and reflections on a really cool thing that I got to do this week. I think I'm supposed to be able to play it cool and be a little more blasé about it, but it was a really cool opportunity, and I'm very excited to share with you what I got to do just a couple of days ago. On Monday, I got a call from the office of the late Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. The Congresswoman's staffers phoned me and invited me to be their guest in Washington on Wednesday for Prime Minister Netanyahu's remarks at the joint session of Congress. It was a lovely invitation. I was very flattered by it, and I'm really thankful to the Congresswoman's wonderful staff who welcomed me so warmly and generously for what was obviously a very important and historic address. So the short time between getting the call on Monday and leaving for the airport early Wednesday morning was a whirlwind of logistics and preparation and all kinds of security clearances. But I eventually got there, and I was welcomed very graciously by the Congresswoman's staff and by the team in the office of House Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who coordinated a number of the visits for those who had been invited by other members of Congress. So I got settled in, I made my way toward the House chamber, and I was able to do some really exciting and invigorating meeting and greeting. I got to meet members of both houses of Congress, some very significant decorated public servants, some notable journalists, members of and leaders of the Jewish community across the country and across the world. I think the thing that had the most touching impact on me, though, was the opportunity to greet the families of some of the hostages from the war in Gaza, some who only recently returned home and others who remain locked in captivity. So all was finally said and done, and we shuffled into the gallery for the Prime Minister's speech, and I'll tell you that I was feeling very nervous before his remarks began. I had a very uneasy sense of anticipation about what he was going to say, how it was going to land, whether this address would be something that wound up benefiting the American Jewish community, benefiting the relationship between the United States and Israel, benefiting the battle for Israel's public image as it trudges forward in a difficult war, facing impossible odds to recover the hostages held in Gaza and eliminate the threat that Hamas poses to Israel and the rest of the world. I'll also say that I was feeling somewhat uneasy personally because I am not the biggest fan of the Prime Minister. I have a fairly dim view of the cabinet he's assembled, of his approach to domestic policy in Israel, and there are a number of things I wish that he had done differently in this war and in his leadership of Israel more broadly. So I came in prepared to be disappointed by what I would hear. But I must give credit where credit is due and tell you that I was very pleased by what I heard the Prime Minister say. Before the visit even began, the press and the media were filled with pundits and journalists warning that the Prime Minister would use his time on Capitol Hill to elevate his supporters in America and tear down his detractors, that he would use this speech as a political wedge to divide Republicans and Democrats, or that he would even make an overt effort to influence the presidential election in November. So I was ready for all of that, and I was ready for what he would say, cringing in anticipation, even before the Speaker of the House called the joint session to order. But I will tell you that the speech that the Prime Minister delivered was terrific. He was forceful and rousing in all the right ways. He was gracious and grateful in the words he addressed to both houses of Congress and to the members on both sides of the aisle. He did what every honored guest ought to do. He said please. He said thank you. He thanked the United States for our partnership and support and promised to continue serving as a steadfast and trustworthy partner to America. And I watched as senators and representatives from both parties stood and applauded when he praised and thanked President Biden and when he did the same for President Trump. That was perhaps the most stirring part of the experience for me, to look around that historic chamber, that citadel of democracy, as the Prime Minister called it, and see the full breadth of our country's leadership. Legislators and diplomats and military personnel, leaders of industry and education and science and the justice system, all present across the spectrum of ideology and partisan affiliation to affirm the importance of the relationship between our two countries. The value of a strong bond between Israel and the United States, of a solid democratic ally in the Middle East, and of robust partnerships that we share in diplomacy, technology, and academia between our two countries that is mutually beneficial and mutually enriching. That was something that was enthusiastically applauded by nearly everybody in that chamber on that day. And that's not to say that there weren't things that I would have liked to have heard differently in that speech. I was very happy to hear him outline a vision for a peaceful post-war Gaza without a long-term Israeli military presence on the ground. But I would have liked to have heard more sympathy for the Palestinian citizens who are victimized by Hamas's despotism and depravity. I would have liked to have heard more details about how he plans to make good on his grand promises to bring home the hostages and about his hopes for diplomatic alliances with the Arab nations in the Gulf. But all told, these are small quarrels with a speech that was overwhelmingly inspiring and important and timely. I was so grateful to the elected officials whose hospitality and outreach to our local community here in Houston made it possible for me to attend. But there's another part of my day in Washington that will stay with me for a very long time in a more difficult way. After the speech, after I left the Capitol building and made my way out of the secure police cordon and went to catch my train to go home, my train connected through Union Station, which I hadn't known in advance was going to become ground zero for the loud and explosive protest, which had boiled up in rage against the presence of an Israeli prime minister. And in a nearly perfect mirror image of what I experienced in the gallery of the chamber of the House, expansive political diversity, models of bipartisan respect and collaboration, a hopeful vision of peacefulness and human dignity and the rule of law, the mob that was gathered outside Union Station would have made your blood run cold. You might have seen some pictures on the news of the hundreds of masked protesters unashamedly waving the flags of Hamas and Hezbollah, vandalizing national monuments and civic infrastructure, spray painting slogans so vile that I can't even use euphemisms to describe them to you tonight, setting fire to American flags and burning effigies of Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden, physically attacking law enforcement officers from the police and National Park Service. It was awful. Something that you'd think would be more fitting for an uprising in a lawless regime in some other part of the world, not Washington, D.C., not just blocks away from the seat of our nation's government. I obviously stayed safe, thank God. I came home to tell the tale to all of you, but I will not forget the shouting and the rage and the violence of those who revile the state of Israel and seek to destabilize its relationship with the United States of America. It felt, in fact, like what the Prime Minister had described in his remarks just moments earlier as a civilizational divide. Not a difference of opinion, but a deep chasm between those who appreciate and affirm the values of moral democracy and those who celebrate the chaos of street justice and vigilantism. And it really impressed upon me how very thin the line is between civility and barbarism, and how narrowly we are all protected from violence breaking through into our lives, the thinnest margin of public decorum keeping it at bay. It is true, passion and indignation are sometimes good. They can be healthy and productive things to feel. Even resentment, even anger, even rage can fuel the engines of social change. But one must be able to restrain oneself from letting that membrane rupture that contains our animal nature, that holds back our capacity for destruction and violence. It seems to be a fact that is inseparable from the experience of being human. The capacity we have for big, bold feelings is somehow permanently tied to our capacity to inflict violence and pain. It's a thing that has always been with us, I suppose. Some of human civilization's earliest stories tell about the destructive potential of vengeance and anger, the all-consuming fire that can be kindled by unchecked resentment and rage. In our own tradition, the story of Cain and Abel, the first few paragraphs of the book of Genesis, show how even before the first human family learns to plant a field or weave a garment, they learn how easy it is to pivot from anger and hurt to wielding weapons of injury and death. This week's Torah portion, in fact, tells the story of another person, a man named Pinchas, a person from a priestly caste who had such high standards of character, we're told, that he becomes enraged when he sees his fellow Israelites acting in a way that offends his sensibilities. The Torah describes how he becomes so infuriated by an act of public immorality that he takes up a spear and executes the offenders in an impulsive, violent act of religious vigilantism. And most troubling of all is that, according to the Parsha, when God looks down and sees what Pinchas has done, when God sees his zealous attachment to the law, sees his obsessive insistence that Israel follow the rules, and that when he sees people straying from them, he's willing to personally enforce deadly consequences on them. When God sees all of this, God blesses him. God says, Hineni noten lo et briti shalom. Therefore, I bestow upon him, God says, my blessing of peace. It is a confounding and upsetting line in a confounding and upsetting story. How can it be that God would bless a vigilante? How can it be that God would bless someone so willing to take up a spear of violence so quickly and rashly? Well, an answer that I think is helpful comes to us from Lithuania in the 19th century. And a rabbi commenting on this portion tells us that the blessing was no accident, and it was, in fact, not an immoral blessing at all. It's not coincidental, the rabbi teaches, that God grants Pinchas a brit shalom, a blessing of peace. Because according to his interpretation, that blessing wasn't a reward for proper behavior, but a prescription for the future. A cure for his spiritual sickness that could rid him of his impulse toward violence in the name of faith. Pinchas's action showed that despite his decisiveness and his zeal, he couldn't have been that much of a spiritual virtuoso after all if he could turn to violence so quickly. God knew that Pinchas's zeal belied a restlessness, and that what he lacked most was the quality of peace. And so God granted him a blessing of peace that he so desperately needed, the ability to walk in a calm current of tranquil self-assurance, even when the immorality of the world heats his passion to a boil. The lesson is that when we are troubled by the world, violence and destruction cannot calm those waters inside. Instead, we need deep spiritual resources and reserves to attain a sense of peace that abides within us so that we can find solutions to the problems that plague us without letting that animal side of our humanness break through. I want to end with a short couplet that comes from the book of Psalms. This is a pair of lines that Rabbi Walter uses frequently when he offers benedictions to our congregation. The words of the psalm goes like this: Adoni oz le'amo yitain, Adoni yivarech et amo v'shalom. May God grant strength to our people. May God bless our people with peace. Now it sounds from first read that what the psalmist is asking for is a pair of blessings: strength and peace. But what the rabbis teach us is that what seems to be two blessings is in fact only one. That what God understands and what God longs for us to understand is that the true strength we can hope for, what real power looks like, is not the power to do harm or inflict pain. What real strength means, what real strength looks like, is the ability to restrain our tendency toward vengeance and instead use our ingenuity, our wisdom, our relationships, and our spiritual heritage to make peace in our community and around the world. And so with that hope, we'll conclude this section of our service with a musical setting of the psalm expressing the ancient hope for the twin values of strength and peace.
Adonai
Adonai grant strength to our people. May Adonai bless our people with peace. Amen.
Amen.